Well, today I am pleased to be able to introduce CFTC Commissioner Brian Quintenz. Commissioner Quintenz is one of the three commissioners at the CFTC. He has been incredibly thoughtful and supportive of the CFTC's efforts in the industry unveiling Bitcoin futures products. He's also the sponsor of the CFTC's Technology Advisory Committee, which recently met to discuss blockchain technology and virtual currencies. And just a few weeks ago, he advocated for the virtual currency industry to create a self-regulatory-like structure. He's created a lot of headlines for that. So please help me in welcoming our friend, Commissioner Quintenz.
Thank you, everybody, and thank you, Perry Ann, for that introduction. It's great to be with you, and congratulations to you and the Chamber for hosting such a fascinating event with such robust participation. What you've accomplished in such a short period of time is really incredible, so I hope you're very proud of it. It's fun to be here. Before I begin, I just have to make a general disclaimer that the views I'm about to present are my own and do not represent those of the Commission. That's some Washington legalese that I'm getting very bored of saying, but I have to say it every single time. But I wanted to start with a story from my childhood. I have a fraternal twin brother who actually is here in the audience tonight. He's visiting from Colorado today, so I thought I'd bring him to heckle me. And we were really competitive when we were growing up. We were competitive academically, we were competitive socially, we were competitive athletically. And one of the sports that we both played was tennis. And if you think about tennis at the amateur level, you know, in juniors and in high school and even college, the players themselves act as the referees. You know, but if you think about that landscape as it progresses into competitive tennis, as the seriousness of that sport moves into professional competition and the consequences of winning increase, ultimately you have umpires that are called in to officiate the game. And you know, I believe that we're really at that point now with cryptocurrency platforms, and where we have millions, if not billions of dollars worth of products being traded and transacted on a daily basis, and that some level of independent officiating is now required. And I'm going to get to that a little bit more in a minute, but I think it would be helpful maybe for some of you in the audience if we kind of took a step back and thought about how the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, the CFTC, you know, the traditional regulator of frozen concentrated orange juice and pork bellies, got into the cryptocurrency space. And you know, since Satoshi really first published his paper, well, 10 years ago now, almost 10 years ago in October, I think, we've just witnessed this exponential growth in technology that has been spawned by the Bitcoin blockchain and the DLT concept. And we see a proliferation of literally thousands of new currencies and new tokens. The transaction platform landscape is also evolving. People can now purchase Bitcoin in a lot of locations around DC. There's a falafel shop in Adams Morgan you can get Bitcoin at. There's a beer and wine market in Columbia Heights, a laundromat out in Falls Church, out in Virginia. And although it sometimes feels like it, the market for cryptocurrencies and digital assets did not develop overnight, and neither did the CFTC's thinking about these products and these markets. So Congress, through the Commodity Exchange Act, the CEA, which is our binding, guiding statute, granted the CFTC exclusive jurisdiction over futures, options, and swaps on commodities. And the CEA defines the term commodity very broadly to include, among other things, all goods and articles and all services, rights, and interests in which contracts for future delivery are presently or in the future dealt in. So basically, everything that can be bought and sold is a commodity. When we talk about virtual currencies in some cases as commodities. We're not making a value judgment on them. We're basically saying that the broadest term in law applies to them. And so in December of 2014, then CFTC Chairman Tim Massad declared through congressional testimony that the Commission viewed virtual currencies as commodities. And the former chairman explained that although the Commission did not have policies and procedures specific to virtual currencies like Bitcoin, the Commission's, quote, authority extends to futures and swaps contracts in any commodity and therefore also on derivatives contracts based on a virtual currency. So 9 months later, in September of 2015, this interpretation was formalized actually through a CFTC enforcement action. The CFTC filed and settled a complaint against a Bitcoin trading platform called Derivabit, which was owned and operated by a company called CoinFlip. And that trading platform offered to connect buyers and sellers of Bitcoin options contracts. So in the order, the CFTC asserted jurisdiction over Derivabit's activities by determining that Bitcoin and other virtual currencies are encompassed in the definition and properly defined as commodities. So based upon this finding, the CFTC found that that platform had illegally offered commodity options without being registered as an exchange or as a swap execution facility in accordance with our regulations. So that CoinFlip case was actually the first time the CFTC asserted jurisdiction over contracts involving Bitcoin and recognizing that Bitcoin was a commodity. But that jurisdiction was limited when it came to the actual trading of Bitcoin itself. And it's important to recognize that in the derivatives market space, the CFTC has both oversight and enforcement authority. While in the spot market, in the markets where you go to actually buy and sell virtual currencies, those platforms, we only have enforcement authority over them. So that enforcement authority, in terms of the derivatives trading, our role is broad and far-reaching. It encompasses things like setting requirements for registration, trade execution, orderly trading, data reporting, record keeping, financial resources. But in the spot markets, in the spot platforms, neither the CFTC nor any other federal agency has that same oversight authority. This means that our agency nor any agency can impose things like registration requirements, surveil and monitor the platforms, or otherwise require compliance with business conduct standards or other ethical trading practices. The CFTC only has enforcement authority to police fraud and manipulation in the actual trading of commodities. So pursuant to that enforcement jurisdiction, the CFTC can investigate potential fraud and manipulation in underlying virtual currency spot markets. And one area where the Commission has taken enforcement action against a spot market platform involves what we kind of consider as to be look-alike futures contracts offered to retail customers. In the Dodd-Frank Act, Congress added a provision to the CEA, to the Commodity Exchange Act, known as the Retail Commodity Provision. And that states that if an entity offers a commodity for sale to a retail customer, and then that transaction is margined, leveraged, or financed, in other words, using borrowed funds, then the agreement is regulated as if it were a futures contract. So regulated like futures, these contracts then become subject to CFTC requirements related to exchange trading and registration. They have to be traded on an exchange. There's an important exception to this, though, which is that if that commodity that is offered to a retail participant under a margin leveraged or finance transaction is actually delivered within 28 days, then that transaction actually does involve a spot sale. It's not a futures contract, it's actually a spot sale. So within a year of the CoinFlip case, the CFTC filed and settled a case against a Hong Kong-based company called Bitfinex. Bitfinex held itself out as a spot exchange where retail customers could buy and sell Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. However, the exchange permitted retail customers to purchase Bitcoin on a leveraged, margined, or financed basis, thereby transforming what might have been a vanilla spot transaction into a lookalike futures transaction within the Commission's jurisdiction. So in the case of Bitfinex, the Commission found that Bitfinex failed to actually deliver the Bitcoin to the buyers because Bitfinex held the Bitcoin in its own private wallet and retained control of all the private keys that permitted access to that wallet. So because delivery did not occur, the Commission found that these financed retail commodity transactions did not meet the exception for actual delivery and should have been executed on a registered exchange like any other futures contract. In addition, the Commission determined that Bitfinex should have been registered as a futures commissions merchant, basically our term for a futures broker-dealer. And while I agree with the outcome of the Bitfinex case, this is also an example of an agency setting policy through enforcement, which is something that I think agencies in general need to try to avoid. Prior to Bitfinex, the CFTC had never before addressed what actual delivery means in the context of cryptocurrencies. Although the agency did issue guidance in 2011 about the actual delivery in the context of physical commodities like wheat or oil. But therefore, in the Bitfinex case, there may have been some confusion about what constituted actual delivery for cryptocurrencies. So I think, generally getting back to, setting policy through enforcement, I think an optimal approach to regulation, especially of an incipient but growing market, is for the regulator to provide that market with clarity, with guidance, or even with some type of bright line test that gives some indication of the agency's potential interpretation of its own regulations. That's why, although I believe the Bitfinex case was settled correctly, I was pleased to see that the Commission issue just this last December a proposed guidance about the meaning of actual delivery in the context of cryptocurrency transactions. That proposed interpretation builds upon past Commission guidance and focuses on whether the customer can take possession and control of the commodity and use the commodity freely in commerce 28 days after purchase. Those are important terms for us. Independent possession and control and using the commodity freely in commerce. And I'm looking forward to reviewing the public comments on that. I think the public comment period closes soon, or may have just closed. If it's still open and if you have comments, please send them in. And I believe that we'll benefit greatly from the development of a very clear standard as to when financed virtual currencies are considered actually delivered to retail customers. But we entered into a new chapter in cryptocurrencies this past December when both CME Group and CBOE listed futures contracts on Bitcoin. And I'd like to take a quick minute to address some concerns I've heard regarding cryptocurrency futures in general. For those who may be concerned by the speed at which a new cryptocurrency futures contract may be listed, it is not the case that a cryptocurrency or token can be issued today and have a futures contract on it tomorrow. One of the core principles in the Commodity Exchange Act, in the CEA, to which an exchange must adhere in listing futures contracts, is to ensure the financial integrity of its transactions, including the clearing and settlement of those transactions with a clearinghouse. One measure of a futures contract's financial integrity is the contract's initial margin level. In order to gain comfort that a contract's initial margin is set commensurate with the volatility of the underlying asset, the Commission generally likes to see a historic time series of price data that either represents a full economic cycle or that covers some period of significant stress. In terms of Bitcoin futures, the Commission had 5 years worth of price data with multiple periods of stress with which to backtest that initial margin sufficiency. And I would expect to see similar time periods of price data for any new cryptocurrency futures contract proposals. From a risk perspective, it's important to note that the Commission is concerned with only 1 or 2 day price volatility, not weekly volatility, not monthly volatility, certainly not yearly volatility. This is because variation margin payments are exchanged at the end of every day, which resets any positive or negative exposure back to zero. Losses, therefore, cannot accrue over time. both the CME and CBOE set initial margin requirements for Bitcoin futures contracts that take into account their potential one-day volatility. CME's initial margin is currently set at 47% of the notional value of its contract, while CBOE's initial margin is 44%. As a point of comparison, just for reference, these margin requirements are about 10 times more than the initial margin requirements on something like a corn contract. And the amount that a futures contract's daily price moves would eat into that initial margin is something that we call margin erosion. And our staff monitors every contract's margin erosion on a daily basis to ensure that required initial margin levels remain adequate. And over the past 2 months, we have seen only one example of Bitcoin price movements eroding its contract's initial margin by up to 50%. In contrast, during that same time period, on 11 separate occasions, the volatility in the WTI crude contract eroded initial margin levels by more than 50%, 11 times, and on some occasions up to 70%. Similarly, during that time period, there were 5 instances of price movements in CME's 10-year Treasury futures contract, which eroded initial margin by more than 50%. So as a general matter, based on CFTC regulations, there are 2 or 3 initial margin breaches per year that we would consider to be reasonable. So to date, the initial margin for Bitcoin futures contracts has performed as required and expected. So while it's important to monitor and regularly reevaluate the performance of Bitcoin futures contracts, I believe that the Commission and clearinghouses do have the tools and the expertise to make any necessary adjustments. So looking ahead, in the midst of this technological revolution, which promises to transform the building blocks of not just our financial markets, but of commerce in general, I'm very honored to be the sponsor of the CFTC's Technology Advisory Committee, where we solicit experts from outside of the Commission to advise the agency on technology developments. The TAC is going to serve as an immeasurable well of knowledge from which we can draw. We had our first meeting about 3 weeks ago. It was the first meeting of the Technology Advisory Committee in 2 years. It was only the 3rd meeting in the last 4 years, so there was a lot to discuss. We created 4 subcommittees to provide actionable advice regarding cryptocurrencies, DLT, cybersecurity, and the risks that are posed by the modern algorithmic trading environment. That last subcommittee, let me mention it quickly because it's important to note, I think that the Commission should never be in a situation of proposing regulations in search of problems. And in my view, that's exactly what happened at the Commission over the last 4 years in terms of discussing the risks posed by the algorithmic trading environment. And the proposed solution to that was what became known as Reg AT. I would like to use the subcommittee that has been formed around the risks of the modern trading environment to better inform the Commission as to the true risks in that environment and any necessary rules or regulations that can help solve those risks. So I also expressed my willingness in that TAC meeting to explore how a new private independent organization could perform oversight functions for cryptocurrency platforms. That's what I think Perry Ann was referring to when we talked about self-regulatory organizations. There are plenty of examples of self-regulatory organizations in our markets. There are 2 prominent ones in the financial markets. There's FINRA for the securities market, and there's the NFA, the National Futures Association, in the futures market. But currently, with regard to cryptocurrency platforms, there is just a patchwork of state and federal regulators that have jurisdiction. And in my opinion, the area with the greatest need for enhanced regulatory certainty and oversight is the spot market, are the platforms where you can actually go buy and sell cryptocurrencies. Today, the state regulators and the Treasury Department's Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, regulate cryptocurrency platforms as money service businesses. While cryptocurrency exchanges can resemble traditional money transmitting services, there are enough differences to warrant different regulatory treatment. So as Congress works with federal and state regulators to determine the appropriate regulatory framework for cryptocurrency platforms, I believe that an SRO-like entity could develop industry standards that could inform and even serve as a blueprint for future action. Indeed, we're already seeing a movement towards self-regulation in the cryptocurrency sector. A cryptocurrency trade association called Crypto UK was recently established in the United Kingdom. That organization has established a code of conduct for its members, which include guidelines around due diligence checks, customer protections, and pricing transparency. Similarly, the heads of 2 cryptocurrency trade groups in Japan, together with the country's 16 spot exchanges, have committed to establishing a new self-regulatory body. And in the United States, efforts towards standardization are also underway at the state level. 7 states have agreed to recognize each other's money service business licenses, and model state virtual currency laws have been published. I think an independent self-regulating body for spot platforms in the United States could significantly contribute to the ongoing efforts to rationalize and formalize cryptocurrency regulation. Initially, this entity could establish best practices for spot platforms, including setting minimum standards of fitness for their employees. But eventually, and hopefully soon, an independent body like this could actually enforce rules on its own membership, supervise them for compliance, and provide a forum for customers to seek redress against member platforms, just like FINRA and just like the NFA do for securities and derivatives markets today. An SRO-like independent regulatory body could create uniform standards for these trading platforms, reduce the possibility of regulatory arbitrage, and avoid duplicative regulation. A private cryptocurrency oversight body does have several advantages. First, as a private membership organization, it could begin providing oversight over spot platforms far more quickly than any federal regulatory regime, which would have to be established following congressional action and a new law being created. A case in point is the regulation of the off-exchange retail foreign exchange industry. The NFA began regulating this sector 7 years before the CFTC did. SRO-like entities also provide numerous efficiencies. They're funded by their members. They're not funded by the federal government. They can adopt and amend rules more quickly than a federal agency. The rules and best practices published by an SRO are informed by practical expertise because the organization has input from different industry participants. This is especially beneficial in cases of rapid evolving industry like cryptocurrencies, where products and trading conventions are constantly changing. Additionally, past SROs have not limited their functions to enforcing fair trading practices. Back in the 1980s, or back in the 1890s, the Butter and Cheese Exchange of New York, no wonder you haven't heard of it, the predecessor to the New York Merc, implemented groundbreaking methods of standardizing butter, cheese, and eggs. NYMEX actually graded and inspected butter before the U.S. Department of Agriculture did. And there's certainly a broad role for a private cryptocurrency oversight body to play in developing the cryptocurrency markets. I would also point out that there's actually a long history of SROs in the United States futures industries dating back to the mid-19th century, decades prior to the adoption of federal regulation. We hear a lot about how can people regulate themselves, and the answer is that they have for a long time. The Chicago Board of Trade began enforcing rules on its own members in 1859. It was about 70 years before the creation of the first futures federal regulator, when CBOT member Joe Leiter, the wheat king, attempted to corner the December wheat market, and CBOT suspended Leiter from the exchange. And in contrast, state anti-corner legislation statutes were ineffective, despite the introduction of over 200 different futures regulation bills in Congress between the years 1880 and 1920. No federal legislation was passed until 1921. Moreover, Congress has repeatedly called for self-regulation in conjunction with federal oversight of financial markets. When the CFTC was first created in 1974, its authorizing statute included provisions for a registered futures association, or an RFA, to be supervised by the CFTC. And the NFA became the first RFA in 1981 and still serves that function today. FINRA traces its history to the Maloney Act of 1938, which created the National Association of Securities Dealers to promote oversight of the over-the-counter securities market. The Municipal Services Rulemaking Board, MSRB, has served as the SRO for firms operating in the municipal securities space since the Securities Act amendments of 1975. Any SRO body should have policies and procedures to address potential conflicts of interest between itself and the industry it regulates. It should strive to have fair representation and diverse views among its members and its leaders, but such entities need not develop standards for independence and fairness from scratch. The International Organization of Securities Commissioners, IOSCO, which is basically an international group of regulators, has actually developed and internationally recognized principles for self-regulation. And according to that benchmark, an SRO should establish standards of corporate governance to effectively manage any conflicts of interest. IOSCO calls upon SROs to observe standards of fairness and confidentiality when exercising powers and responsibilities, and to avoid rules that may create anti-competitive situations or allow market participants to unfairly gain advantage in the marketplace. The SRO should have the ability to enforce compliance by its members with its standards and should develop rules that promote investor protection and market integrity. Compliance with IOSCO's robust set of protocols would lend credibility to any SRO-like body for cryptocurrency spot platforms. Ultimately, IOSCO's framework calls for the SRO to be subject to the oversight of a federal or a government regulator who can assume the responsibility should the SRO exhibit conflicts of interest on its own or prove unable to discharge its responsibilities. But to date, Congress has not authorized the creation of an SRO to serve in this capacity in the cryptocurrency market. Notwithstanding that fact, I believe that while Congress considers what, if any, federal action in this area is appropriate, an SRO-like entity could begin to develop ideas and standards that would strengthen the integrity of the spot markets. We regularly hear from cryptocurrency market participants that they desire a more credible, regulated marketplace. I believe that a private cryptocurrency oversight body could help bridge the gap between the status quo and future government regulation. So, in conclusion, while my tennis matches with my brother never rose to the level that needed a referee, although it could have led to less squabbling, I think we've come to a point with cryptocurrencies where an independent body must step up, establish, and enforce rules of the game. It's my hope that cryptocurrency platforms in the United States will consider the many benefits, including enhanced credibility, that the establishment of an SRO-like organization may provide. Moreover, in light of the global market for cryptocurrencies and the efforts currently underway in the United Kingdom and Japan, there is no reason why a private cryptocurrency oversight body could not achieve global significance. And I believe we can and we should provide leadership in that area. I look forward to working together with you, with Perry Ann in the Chamber, and with any other industry participants that seek our advice or our help or our recommendations to strengthen the integrity of these growing markets. Thank you all very much. It's a privilege to be back here at McDonough. Thank you.